My stepfather managed to ruin my life until my mother finally opened her eyes. I was 16 when my mom married my stepfather, and I didn't realize until years later that the worst thing about him wasn't anything he did openly. It was what he did quietly and with a smile that made other people trust him instantly. His name was Mark. He came into our lives after my dad died, which already meant he had an unfair advantage. Anyone who showed up with stability, a steady income, and the ability to make my mom laugh again was always going to be welcomed more warmly than they should have been. But in my eyes, anyone who wasn't my dad felt like an intruder. I didn't hate him at first. That part matters. At first, Mark was just there, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at him. He paid for dinners, fixed things around the house, and never raised his voice. He never drank too much, never swore, and never did anything that would have made for an obvious warning sign. That's why it took so long for anyone to believe me when things started going wrong. My mom, Ruby, had been tired for years from being a widow and also a single parent. The kind of tired where you're grateful someone else is willing to carry even a fraction of the weight. Mark stepped into that role perfectly. He took over the bills, household decisions, and anything else that required firmness, so my mom didn't have to be the bad guy anymore. The house changed after he moved in. Not structurally, but atmospherically. The rooms felt quieter, like sound itself had rules now. I became hyper-aware of where I walked, how long I stayed in shared spaces, and whether I was in the way. Mark never told me outright that I was a problem. He'd rearrange the kitchen and then gently remind me that things had a place now. He'd throw out food I bought with my own money because it didn't fit the meal plan. He'd move my shoes, my backpack, and my jacket, always just enough that I'd spend an extra minute looking for them. If I mentioned it, he'd smile and say I must have forgotten. My mom always believed him. Mark had a way of framing everything as concern. Concern about my grades, concern about my attitude, concern about my future. He'd sit at the table with paperwork and spreadsheets and talk about discipline and structure. Those words sounded responsible but felt like a cage when they were applied only to me. By the time I turned 17, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't being parented, I was being managed. Mark tracked everything I did without ever announcing it. He knew when I came home late even if he wasn't there. He knew which friends I stopped talking to and which ones I spent more time with. He'd casually mention things I hadn't told him, not accusingly, just as observations. He never punished me directly. That would have required confrontation. Instead, privileges quietly disappeared. Rides stopped being available. Requests went unanswered. Access to things I'd always had slowly evaporated, and if I asked why, the explanation was always vague. It was never his decision, apparently. It was what made sense. The worst part was how invisible it all was. Teachers loved him, neighbors trusted him, and family friends praised how lucky I was to have such a steady male role model after losing my dad. I started doubting myself. Maybe I really was forgetful. Maybe I really was dramatic. Maybe. This was just what growing up felt like, and I was handling it badly. But then college applications started. Mark inserted himself into every step of the process. He framed it as financial responsibility and protecting me from debt and disappointment. He insisted on seeing every application, every essay, every email. My mom stayed out of it. She trusted him completely. I noticed slowly that the schools I cared about never seemed to respond, that deadlines passed without confirmation emails, that recommendation letters went missing, that my carefully tracked checklist never matched the reality. When I asked Mark about it, he never denied anything. He just spoke in circles until I felt embarrassed for asking. By spring, my options had narrowed to exactly one school. The one he preferred. It was close to home, affordable, practical, and it ensured I wouldn't leave. That summer, I worked 2 jobs. I saved aggressively and planned quietly. I learned how to live inside my head without revealing anything. Mark thrived on reactions, even subtle ones, so I learned to give him none. He noticed. That was when the rules tightened. Curfews shifted. Expectations changed without warning, and things I'd been allowed to do for years were suddenly disrespectful. The house began to feel less like a place I lived and more like a test I was constantly failing. The first time I realized Mark was actively lying about me, not just controlling me, was over something painfully small. A missing envelope. It was a financial aid letter. I knew exactly where I'd left it on the counter. It was under a magnet. I remembered because I'd smoothed it flat 3 times, nervous about creasing it. When I went to grab it the next day, it was gone. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked. Mark said he hadn't seen it. My mom assumed I misplaced it. I searched the house anyway. Every drawer, every trash can, every folder. 2 weeks later, Mark casually mentioned that the aid package wasn't very good anyway. I froze and asked how he knew. He said my mom had shown him, but she hadn't. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not anger, clarity. The kind that settles quietly and doesn't go away. Mark wasn't reacting to me. He was planning around me. I noticed how he framed conversations so I sounded unstable. How he'd expressed concern about my stress levels right after provoking me behind closed doors. How he'd mention my forgetfulness right after moving my things. He wasn't trying to hurt me directly. He was trying to rewrite who I was to everyone else. The real cruelty wasn't the control, it was the isolation. Slowly, carefully, Mark positioned himself as the reasonable interpreter of my behavior. Any resistance I showed only confirmed his narrative. By the time I moved into that one approved college, I felt like I was already on probation in my own life. I came home most weekends because it was expected. Because it was family. Because any hesitation was read as avoidance. The house felt heavier each time. Mark had fully settled into authority. He spoke for my mom even when she was in the room. He corrected her memory gently when it didn't align with his. He decided what was discussed and what was dropped. I started to see it happen to her too. She deferred to him constantly. Not because she was weak, but because she trusted him. He never raised his voice or rushed her. He just always seemed to know better. The turning point didn't come with a blow-up. It came with a spreadsheet. I found it accidentally while using the family computer. A file with my name on it. It wasn't a budget or a schedule, it was an evaluation. Pages of notes, incidents, character traits, and emotional assessments. Everything was written clinically, like I was a project that needed correcting. Some of it wasn't even true. Some of it was deliberately misleading. I didn't confront him, but I took photos before I closed the file. I sat very still and tried not to shake. That night, I watched my mom laugh at something he said, unaware she was married to a man who kept dossiers on her child. That was when I stopped hoping she'd notice on her own. I needed proof that couldn't be explained away. Over the next year, Mark got sloppier. Control requires energy, and I was no longer reacting the way he expected. I stayed neutral and unreadable. He escalated by tightening financial strings, blocking opportunities subtly, speaking for me in conversations I wasn't present for, and making decisions on my behalf. I let him because every time he did, he documented it. Every email, every form, every quiet override. College summers were the worst. Living at home meant returning to the subtle cage Mark had built, and I'd learned by then that surviving meant moving carefully, speaking carefully, and never showing the frustration I felt inside. Mark's control had expanded beyond me. He had begun shaping my mom's life the same way. At first, it was little things, scheduling her appointments, gently correcting her decisions, and persuading her to adopt routines she hadn't asked for. Then it escalated. He started managing her finances entirely, insisting she didn't need to see statements. He framed it as relieving her stress and protecting her from mistakes, which sounded caring if you didn't notice the pattern. I saw the changes in her slowly. She smiled less often. She nodded more. She stopped, challenging him even gently about anything he suggested. Even the things she had always loved to do, like painting, her small weekend hikes, and her casual dinners with friends, were now filtered through Mark's approval. I tried small interventions. I left notes. I suggested outings. I gently hinted at financial discrepancies I noticed. She always brushed them off. "Mark's careful," she said. "I trust him." And I understood. I would have trusted him too if I hadn't already lived in his orbit. Mark's tactics were subtle, which made the situation almost impossible to address openly. He never shouted, never broke the law, never made any dramatic moves that could be reported. His weapon was patience, repetition, and invisibility. The longer you lived under his control, the less you realized how much had changed. By the end of my second summer back home, I noticed an entirely new layer to his control. It wasn't just me he was shaping, it was everyone who mattered to me. Family. Friends started sharing strange stories. Friends who had been close were subtly excluded from gatherings. And when I brought it up with my mom, she would hesitate, then say, "I think Mark just thinks it's better this way." By the third summer, the control had begun spilling into arguments I didn't even have. Small family disagreements now leaned entirely on Mark's framing. He would smile, ask neutral questions, and then provide clarity that subtly favored his decisions. My mom would nod, not because she had changed her mind, but because his framing made her second-guess herself. I watched her step back from her own opinions. I watched her apologize for decisions she hadn't made, and I realized, even though Mark never hit anyone, never yelled, and never seemed cruel, he had systematically rewritten the household so he was the center of authority. And yet the worst part was still unseen. While Mark controlled us, he projected charm outward. Neighbors, family friends, even distant relatives thought he was perfect. Everyone assumed my mom's life was stable. Everyone assumed I was lucky. No one suspected that behind closed doors, decisions were being quietly manipulated to isolate, frustrate, and control. No one saw how my opportunities were limited, my achievements downplayed, and my mother's judgment clouded. By the end of that year, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The problem wasn't just Mark, it was the invisibility of his tactics. And fixing it would take proof, patience, and a lot of careful planning. The turning point was subtle. It wasn't a fight or an argument. It wasn't even a moment of clear revelation. It was a series of small betrayals that added up until they couldn't be ignored. I found another financial discrepancy. This time, it was my college savings. Funds I had been slowly putting away for years, intended for tuition, were missing. Not gone entirely, but moved. The explanation Mark gave was plausible. He claimed it was better invested in a safer account, but the truth was clear. It was another layer of control, another example of how he made decisions for me without my consent. I approached my mom carefully. I explained the numbers. I didn't accuse Mark of wrongdoing because that would have sounded paranoid. I asked questions until finally, something clicked. She saw the pattern. Not immediately, not fully, but she saw enough to hesitate. Enough. To start asking her own questions and to begin doubting the man she had trusted completely. From that moment, the atmosphere changed. Mark noticed, of course. His smile became sharper, his interventions more calculated. I watched him subtly try to regain control, framing every conversation, every choice, every small decision as necessary or for the best. But this time, my mom wasn't as compliant. She started resisting in quiet ways like checking statements, questioning decisions, asking for explanations. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations or shouting matches. There were no slamming doors, just slow, quiet erosion of the authority Mark had built. And it worked. Slowly, painstakingly, my mother reclaimed pieces of her autonomy. She made decisions without consulting him first. She asked for opinions rather than directives. She smiled more. She laughed again. She painted, hiked, and reconnected with friends. Mark, of course, resisted in subtle ways. He tried charm, persuasion, guilt, and careful omissions. But the pattern of exposure had begun. The quiet dominance he had relied on could not survive once she started noticing the small manipulations. It would still take months to fully unravel the web he had built. It would take concrete evidence and careful planning to untangle the financial and emotional control he had established. And it would take a willingness to acknowledge that the man my mom had married, the man I had lived under, was not the man we had thought he was. But for the first time, there was hope. Real hope. Not the fleeting, quiet, invisible kind. Not the, maybe I'm imagining it kind. Real hope that we could reclaim our lives. The months after my mom began noticing changes were exhausting. Every step forward felt tentative. Every small victory was matched by Mark's quiet countermeasures. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations. He never raised his voice, threaten, yell, or make ultimatums. He just shifted the rules, around us subtly, as if nothing had changed. And yet, we noticed. I learned quickly how persistent his methods were. He had documents for everything, tracking small incidents, compiling notes about my behavior, my mother's habits, even my friends. He logged patterns in spreadsheets, often under the guise of helpful observations or family planning. The sheer detail was staggering. Every forgotten homework assignment, every late email, every disagreement noted, annotated, and analyzed. My mom was slow to believe the depth of it. She had loved him genuinely once. She had trusted him. And love, especially love after loss, is patient, cautious, and forgiving. But the evidence kept mounting. Small mistakes she once overlooked were now framed in ways that hinted at intentional manipulation. Conversations she remembered differently were subtly corrected. Emails she hadn't sent or had sent but didn't copy him on were referenced in ways that made her question herself. My mom needed to see the full picture herself, so I didn't try to confront him. Instead, we approached it like investigators approaching a case, small, undeniable details building into a narrative that could no longer be explained away. The first step was financial. Mark had quietly shifted money from accounts my mother controlled into ones he controlled. He framed it as simplifying finances and protecting her from poor decisions, but the numbers didn't lie. We sat down with statements from the past 5 years. Every discrepancy, every redirection, every decision made unilaterally was documented. My mom's face shifted as she realized she had been kept from seeing her own money. She didn't cry or yell. She just sat there, slowly processing the quiet invasion of control she hadn't noticed until it was undeniable. The next step was the social and emotional manipulation. We revisited old emails, calendars, and notes from family events, invitations we had received and never got, friends subtly excluded from our lives, small vacations or plans canceled at the last minute. Every action Mark had taken was noted. When I pointed it out, showing patterns and screenshots, my mother finally admitted out loud that she had started feeling isolated, controlled, and anxious, but couldn't understand why. It was surreal watching her articulate what she had only felt vaguely before. She finally realized that the man she had trusted to support her had been controlling her slowly for years, and she hadn't noticed because it was never loud or obvious. Mark's response was equally subtle. He didn't deny the evidence outright. He didn't scream, threaten, or fight. He smiled charmingly and reframed things as misunderstandings or oversights. But we didn't give him reactions. That was key. He thrived on control, and control required engagement. With none, he had nothing but cold, unbreakable facts against him. The final, quiet revelation came with my college records. Forms he had redirected, essays he had reviewed, and letters he had claimed to have sent were all verified, and all had evidence he had manipulated the process to ensure I attended a school he preferred. It wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating, the subtle manipulation of my entire future. And yet, because he hadn't technically broken the law, it had always been impossible to confront openly. Now, with proof, we could address it. My mother confronted him not with anger, but with documentation. Every account discrepancy, every manipulation, every isolation tactic laid bare. There was no room for charm, no space to redirect the narrative. He could smile all he wanted. The facts didn't care. Mark tried to argue, of course. He said he had meant well and acted in our best interests. He tried to reframe his years of subtle dominance as care, framing our complaints as misunderstandings or exaggerations. But this time, my mother wasn't listening. She no longer deferred. She no longer questioned herself. The evidence had shifted the power dynamic irreversibly. The psychological weight of those years became visible in our household. My mother had begun losing trust in her own judgment, feeling guilty for following his lead and doubting herself for years. I had carried anxiety and suppressed anger, learning to move like a ghost in my own home. And now, as we started untangling the threads, the emotional aftermath became apparent. We took the final step, consulting a lawyer. Not for drama and not to win against Mark, but to reclaim autonomy, to regain control of finances, property, and the life Mark had quietly rewritten around himself. My mother needed assurance that the structure he had built would no longer dictate her choices, her freedom, or her child's future. Mark tried subtly to influence the lawyer meetings, to frame things in his preferred narrative. But with documentation, emails, receipts, and consistent timelines, there was no room for his manipulation. His charm was meaningless when confronted with hard evidence. As the legal process began, the strain he had placed on us became tangible. My mother began sleeping better, walking more confidently, and laughing again. I could feel years of tension slowly draining from the house. Mark, of course, adjusted his behavior. He was polite, calm, and careful, still trying to control without overt action. But the reality was that he had lost. The house, the narrative, and our trust were no longer his to manipulate. The final months before the divorce were a careful balance of logistics, emotional processing, and reclaiming routines. My mother reestablished accounts, reconnected with friends, and made her own choices again. I reclaimed personal autonomy, making decisions about school, work, and social life without interference. And Mark, trapped in the inevitability of the evidence, could only observe as the control he had exercised for years quietly slipped away. It was slow. It was painstaking. It was emotionally exhausting. But it worked. And when the day came that the divorce papers were signed, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no final explosive moment. There was only relief. For the first time in years, the house was ours, not Mark's. And even though scars remained as emotional, traces of his manipulation, the isolation, and the constant self-doubt, they were ours to heal, not his to rewrite. The day the divorce was finalized felt almost anticlimactic. There was no final scene where Mark's control was theatrically broken. There was just a piece of paper, signed and filed, that formally marked the end of the invisible cage he had built around our lives. It took years for my mom and I to realize exactly how much of our lives had been quietly dictated. In hindsight, the signs were everywhere, but they were subtle, slow, and invisible. A feeling of walking on eggshells that never seemed connected to any one incident. Looking back, it was almost like living underwater. You don't notice the pressure until you step out of it. The first few weeks after the divorce were surreal. The house felt different. Rooms were no longer measured against an invisible rulebook, and schedules didn't need approval. The air itself seemed lighter. My mom laughed again. She took long walks and reconnected with old friends. She even started painting again, something she hadn't done since the early years of Mark's presence in our lives. For me, the shift was quieter, but no less profound. I realized how much I had internalized his control, how often I second-guessed decisions, how often I hesitated before speaking, how often I silently assessed whether I could act freely. Over time, I learned to trust my own instincts again, to make choices without thinking about how someone else might manipulate them, and to enjoy the simple autonomy of daily life. Rebuilding normal wasn't instantaneous. Emotional scars lingered. I had to confront years of frustration, anger, and subtle fear. I journaled, talked to friends I had distanced myself from, and reflected on how manipulation can exist without overt cruelty. People who haven't experienced this kind of quiet, systematic control often assume abuse has to be loud or dramatic. But Mark's strategy was quiet, legal, and invisible, which made it harder to recognize, harder to confront, and harder to heal from. My mom went through her own process. She had to acknowledge how deeply she had trusted someone who didn't have her best interests at heart. She had to forgive herself for the things she had overlooked and the ways she had been manipulated. She had to relearn her own decision-making, regain confidence in her judgment, and reclaim her independence. It wasn't easy, but step by step she did it. Financial independence also became a priority. My mom reclaimed accounts, reviewed past decisions, and made future plans without deferring to anyone. She began teaching me about financial responsibility, about trusting our own judgment, about making mistakes and learning from them. Mark had framed control as protection, but what we learned in its absence was that true protection comes from knowledge, autonomy, and mutual respect, not invisible manipulation. Looking back, I realized the story wasn't about revenge or punishment. It wasn't about proving he was wrong or making him suffer. It was about reclaiming our lives. It was about taking back the years he had attempted to control, reshaping our world on our own terms, and creating a future where manipulation no longer had a foothold. My mother and I built routines that reflected our own preferences, not someone else's control. We traveled to places we wanted to see, pursued hobbies we had shelved, and created schedules that served us, not someone else's invisible rules. For the first time, we measured success by our own definitions, not by a spreadsheet someone else had created to track our perceived failures. The divorce left no dramatic scars, no court battles lasting years, no confrontations in public, no vindictive games. What remained was subtle but significant. Autonomy restored, trust reclaimed, and emotional space freed. And that, in itself, felt monumental. My mom and I now make decisions together, not as a team influenced by manipulation, but as partners in life. We celebrate our victories, small and large, independently of anyone else's control. We have reclaimed holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings. Our home feels like home again, and our lives feel like our own. The experience left us stronger. We understand the fragility of trust and the subtlety of manipulation. We recognize patterns that previously would have gone unnoticed. And most importantly, we know that even when abuse is quiet, invisible, and legally subtle, it can be confronted, dismantled, and healed from.